Welcome to part 2 of our series on different styles of inheritance that are not simple Mendelian dominant recessiveness. This one has to do with a phenomenon called multiple alleles and a different one called polygenic traits. So we're going to take a look at some of these different things as we go through this particular video. All the pictures on this screen show some different examples of some traits that will fall into these categories. First example, something called multiple alleles. Human blood type is an excellent example of this. So here's a possible question. If you got a mother with type A and a father with type B, they have a child with type O blood. How is that possible? We would expect that if type A was dominant or type B was dominant, then the baby should show one or the other of those traits. But here the baby's showing an actual totally different third type trait. Well, in order to understand this, we need to know a little bit more about how blood typing works. Turns out there's not just 2 alleles for this gene, there's a total of 3. One is called IA and one is called IB, and the third one's called I. This diagram over here on the right kind of shows what this refers to. On your blood cells, in fact all of your cells, there are little surface proteins called antigens, and these little proteins is how your cells know you from not you. It's how your body knows to recognize yours and fight off, say, bacterial infections, or it's how, say, when you hear about someone having a blood transfusion that gets rejected. This is how cells learn to recognize each other. And there's actually 2 different kinds of antigens. There's the type A antigen, you can see right here, the kind of the triangle-y shaped ones are not really that shape. There's the type B antigen, which is a different shape. Type AB actually has both of them, and then type O has neither one. And by the way, the letter I, even though it's kind of awkward, stands for immunoglobulin. What a crazy word, right? Immune system protein. So there's just the 2 types. So again, it looks a little bit different, but we're going to use immunoglobulin type A, immunoglobulin type B, and then neither immunoglobulin. Those are our 3 alleles that we have. So when we're talking about genotypes and phenotypes, there's a little bit more that we need to know. First of all, it turns out that IA, immunoglobulin A, and B are codominant to one another. That's how we get type AB blood. It makes sense, right? If they're codominant, they both express. If you have the A type and the B type gene, then you have both A and B type antigens, type AB blood. Recessive, I, the no antigen gene, is this one over here. That's how you get type O blood. You actually have to have 2 genes that say no protein in order to get blood cells with none of that particular protein on the surface. But if you take a look at type A and type B, there's 2 different ways right here to get type A. You can either get 2 of the dominant A genes or dominant A and recessive lowercase I, that O type gene. Those both give you type A blood. Type B blood, again, same sort of thing. If you have 2, if you're homozygous for that type B gene, that IB, or you could have the dominant IB gene and the recessive O type gene, and both of those will give you type B blood. So let's take a look at how this would work into our Punnett square problem. So our question is, the type A mother and type A father, or sorry, type A mother and type B father have a child with type O blood. How's that possible? Well, here's mom, and here's her type A. We don't know what this other one is. Here's father with his type B, right here. And again, we don't know what the other one was. Remember, there's 2 different genotypes that could give you type A. 2 different genotypes could give you type B. And then here's our child. We know our child is type O because it says so in the problem. So I put him on the inside. In order to have type O blood, you have to have 2 of the recessive I type genes. So now what does this mean for our poor little friend? Well, it means that mom and dad had to have had some different kinds of genes. Mom did not have IAIA. Mom must have gotten the other one from here. And then the same thing, this one had to have come from over here, that we know that dad's other gene had to have been IA little I. So again, it's a little bit of a different circumstance. And so what are their genotypes and phenotypes going to be? Well, mother's genotype has to be IA little I. Father's genotype has to be IB little I, because each parent had to give a little I to their child. So now, what does that mean for their possible blood types for other children? Well, this top left one up here, this would be type AB, right? It would get an IA from mom and an IB from dad. That would give you type AB blood. This square right here, you'd get an IB from dad and a little I from mom. That would be type B blood. This little one down here, if that was a child, that would get an IA from mom and a lowercase I from dad, which would give you type A blood. And then this last one down here, we already met this child, or if they had another child could have this. Little I gives you type O blood, and it's 25% of each. Moving on. If you've heard about that other half of this, by the way, it's called, A positive, O negative. That's actually a whole different gene. It's called the RH gene. And it was actually called RH because it was named after these little dudes, these little rhesus monkeys that it was discovered in. They gave rhesus monkey type A blood, thought the monkey would be fine, and then the monkey died. Whoa. And they realized it wasn't the type A that was a problem or something else. And so, again, if you've ever heard of this before, RH positive means there's another protein that's present in addition to your type A or your type B proteins. RH positive is dominant. RH negative is recessive. So you can see I've got some examples here. If you're type A positive, we'll actually test these in class, you could actually have 4 different possibilities. This gives you type A, and this gives you positive. This gives you type A. This also gives you positive. Again, that negative gene's recessive, so it's going to be positive in terms of phenotype. Down at the bottom, IA little I is still type A, and plus plus will give you positive, and IA little I gives you A, and plus minus gives you positive. If you're O negative, and there will be a few of you in class that are, there's only one way to get that particular one. Your genotype has to be recessive at both genes. Little I for the O, and then negative negative for the RH. I just put that in there as an aside because I know you've heard of it. All right, case number 2. What happens if a tall guy and a short woman, tall guy and a short guy, really? A tall guy and a short girl have kids. When we talked about Mendel's P's, remember, tall was dominant, short was recessive. We know that's not quite true in human height. So what happens in our case? Well, humans can be almost any height possible. It's not just tall or short. You could be tall, medium, extra tall, extra medium, extra short, as the case may be. When we take a look at a graph, you can kind of see this really interesting sort of shape that looks like this, where you get a rainbow, they call it. It's not quite a rainbow, and if a rainbow looked like that, I'd wonder what was going on. But that sort of rainbow shape is really classic for a second type of inheritance called polygenism or polygenic traits. Polygenic is exactly what it sounds like. More than one gene, polygene. And this is a different circumstance than multiple alleles. So polygenic traits are usually determined by bunches of genes, and it's kind of additive. So the more dominant traits you have, the more of that trait you express. The more recessive traits you have, the less of that trait you express. So I've got an example right here, and this isn't quite right, but it'll give you the idea that if there's 3 different genes, gene A, gene B, and gene C, that all controlled your height, then the total number of dominant genes would add 2 inches to the base height. I have right here the base height as being 5'2" if you're all recessive. If you're 5'4", then you have 2 additional inches to it. So there's a couple of different ways you could do it, right? Any one spot could have a dominant trait, and that would add 2 inches to your height. If you want to add another 2 inches, you'd have to have 2 dominant alleles somewhere in your set of 6 total alleles. So you could have big A, or in like this case, you could have big A, big B, something along those lines. It's the total number of dominants that gives you the total amount of height that you have out on there. And if you actually work it all out, for example, if you had all of them dominant all the way across, all 6, you'd end up being, say, 6'2". Again, I know that's not exactly right because humans can be shorter than 5'2" and taller than 6'2", but you get the kind of idea. It's an additive sort of idea. Skin color, by the way, works the same way. It's the total number of dominant traits gives you darker skin. Those of us with relatively light skin have more recessive traits. So, taking a look at some other things, for example, eye color. You can take a look at the range from the least amount of pigment down to the most amount of pigment. This is polygenic, kind of a rainbow of colors of eyes. Hair color. Do you know that there's this many different colors of brownish hair that are out there? I'm not talking about total white, and I'm not talking about total black, because those are different. But in terms of browns, it's additive how many different dominant genes you have. And even in other species, for example, coat color is polygenic. This isn't quite additive, but there's a lot of different things that determine how much pigment you have, whether it's smooth, whether it's speckly like some of these particular dogs are, whether you have this kind of classic tuxedo pattern. All different kinds of genes relate together to give you an overall picture of coat color, and that's called a polygenic trait. Here's a special case of polygenic, and this is one of my favorites. It's called epistasis, and this is how black labs and golden labs and chocolate labs get their particular color. It is actually possible, if you've ever had labs before, that a mommy lab can actually have lots of different color baby labs all in the same litter, and they're all related to one dad. I'm not saying that there's multiple dads involved here, that there's different ways that their particular coat color gets expressed. And epistasis is the reason for this. It's a type of polygenic inheritance. It's polygenic because there's actually more than one gene. In fact, there's two genes in this case that control it. And there's one gene that determines whether or not the dog can make black pigment or brown pigment. And this is a regular dominant recessive gene all by itself. So if you've got that dominant gene, you're going to be a black lab, either big B or big B little b. And then if you're recessive for that particular one, you get chocolate. Beautiful little happy chocolate labs. But this does not explain how we get yellow labs. And this is where the epistasis part comes in. There's a second gene. Oh, somehow I missed it. There's a second gene that's involved. There it is. Epistasis is when you've got one gene controlling whether or not a different gene is turned on and off. And in this particular case, it's called the E gene for expression, that if you're dominant for that, you express the pigment gene. If you're recessive for it, you don't express the pigment gene. So, if you're dominant, you're going to express black or brown, depending on what you've got for the B gene. But if you're recessive, you get yellow labs. You don't express any of the pigment gene. And again, this is a special case of polygenic because it's more than one gene. Multiple alleles is one gene with 3 or more alleles. Blood type is one gene. If you're talking about polygenic, it's several genes. And when we're talking about height, eye color, skin color, it's lots and lots of genes that add up. We're talking about a special case like epistasis, actually just 2 genes, but still it's 2 genes that work together to control the exact same trait. The ABO plus minus is not polygenic because they're 2 separate traits, and each trait's controlled by one gene. One gene controls the ABO part, and a separate one gene controls the Rh positive or Rh negative. So there you have it. Polygenic and multiple alleles. If you're looking for some extra ideas on how to go above and beyond, you can hit pause, and there's some different ideas on this one that you can go for. Otherwise, see you in class tomorrow.